Good morning. I was kind of delaying for a minute because apparently my PowerPoint didn't come through to Steve, so I had Paula running out in the car to get my phone to see if I could retrieve it, but she got lost in the parking lot, I guess. So, I don't want to spend too much time introducing the difficulties of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, but I feel like we have to talk about that just a little bit as we begin. I think it's easy to say that 1 Corinthians chapter 7 as a whole is easily the most difficult group of scripture in the New Testament. And most of you are probably already aware of that. There are a lot of really smart people, great Bible students, who have disagreements about different parts of this text, different aspects of this text. So it's a challenge to get through it. We're also challenged by the fact that we have very little time to do it. So I explained to Paula on the way here, just kind of rehearsing what I was going to say in the beginning of class, and it took 12 minutes to get through the first of 3 points of my caveat. So I'm going to have to shorten that down a little bit. But before we get into the text of 1 Corinthians 7, I do want to highlight what I think are the three most difficult challenges that we look at. One moment here, let me just double check. See if I can figure out what I did with my PowerPoint. So evidently I shut down my computer before it went through, so we don't have it. So there are three challenges to this passage. There are more than three, but the three that I think are most significant is, number one, is Paul given instructions in this chapter that apply to the life of the Corinthians prior to them becoming Christians? Or is he given instructions that apply to them now that they are Christians? Right? That's the first great difficulty. That's not a difficulty for everyone. It has typically been a difficulty within our tradition. Homer Haley famously took the position that it does not apply to them prior to becoming Christians, and he took a lot of heat for that. I tend to believe that that's correct. But it is something for you to work through and come to conclusions on. The second thing, for example, just to give an illustration of that, is if you were married and divorced and married again, for some reason other than adultery, does this passage teach that once you become a Christian, you have to divorce or leave the spouse that you were with in that second marriage prior to becoming a Christian? That's the controversy. Or you become a Christian and your slate is wiped clean and you are to remain as you are. All right? So I'll tell you up front, that's the position that I take. And I don't even have to do a poll to know that there are some of you who would not agree with that. But that's a position I take. But that's the first great question. Second is in chapter 7 and verse 8, Paul addresses the unmarried and widows. The meaning, how we should understand the word unmarried there, is a great difficulty. The commentary that I rely upon the most in my study of 1 Corinthians, written by a man named Gordon Fee, great commentary, he's a great Bible student. He makes a pretty good case that the word unmarried in chapter 7 and verse 8, where it says, I say to the unmarried and widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. He makes a case that the word unmarried there really is referring to widowers. That at the time this was written, there was no word in Koine Greek, oddly enough, for widowers. There was a word for widows, women who had lost a spouse in death. And it seems in this case, he makes the argument that what he's really speaking to here is widowers and widows. And he refers to the unmarried here as a word that was used accommodatively to refer to widowers. Well, that changes how you understand that passage if you take it that way. On the other hand, he would also argue that widowers, or the unmarried here, doesn't mean to people who've never been married, because he will later address virgins, which is really referring to the unmarried, never married rather. So he's not talking to people about people who've never been married when he says unmarried. So the only other possibility is that he may mean people who have been divorced. So is he referring to people who've been divorced and then widows? But the idea of widower makes sense because throughout this passage, Paul puts men and women on equal footing. Matter of fact, one of the striking parts of this passage is that he puts men and women on equal footing. And what's interesting about that is that's in contrast. Paul is talking to a Roman Greek society. When you see anything talked about in a Jewish context, things like this, does it sound like men and women are on equal footing? No. In Jewish culture, women weren't allowed to put away a husband. That's why you always read about the men putting away their wife, because the Jews didn't allow a woman to put away her husband. But the Greeks and Romans did, and Paul speaks about it in that way. He speaks about husbands putting away their wives and wives putting away their husbands, right? And that's very notable because it is a change in what we would typically have seen in a very Jewish setting. So one of the challenges then is chapter 7 and verse 8, who are the unmarried? So now if you say, well, it could be a divorced person, it could be a man who was widowed. If it's a divorced person, does he then allow the person who was divorced when they became a Christian to remarry? In other words, the slate is clean, right? And I can tell you that's a lot of the things in this chapter are so difficult because they're very linguistic. It is, you really have to spend some time looking at what Paul says in multiple places. You have to go back and spend some time trying to understand. You don't have to be a Greek scholar, by the way, to study the original languages. There are plenty of resources that will help you do that. But you do have to spend some time doing that. And then the third, what I think is probably the third challenge, at least for me, is when you come over to chapter 7 and verse 15, where Paul refers to the person who was married to an unbeliever who leaves. He says that they are not under bondage, meaning the spouse who has left is not under bondage. What does Paul mean there? Does it mean that the same thing when he says in Romans chapter 7, when he talks about a wife is under bondage so long as her husband lives? Well, that seems to really kind of explain that passage, but you have to understand that he's not using the same word in 1 Corinthians 7:15 as he is in Romans 7. In fact, he concludes this chapter by saying, in my opinion, or he concludes this chapter by saying, a wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. That sounds exactly like Romans chapter 7. In fact, he uses the same word in Romans chapter 7, and it would seem to kind of preclude the idea in chapter 7, verse 15, that what he means is she's free to marry, or he is free to marry. So all I would say is if you're wrestling with this passage, if you're in a circumstance that this passage may address, you need to spend a lot of time. It would be very easy in this passage to find whatever answer you want to find if you're not looking beyond an English translation. All right? So that's my caveat, and I did it in about 5 or 6 minutes less than I did when I gave it to Paula, so I did good on that. But those are the passages, the verses that we come into confront us about what our understanding of it is. And so, but that last part that I said, it really is important that we come to a passage like this with an open mind, and that we are willing to put the work in to try to understand it rather than just look for the answer we want to find. And that happens on both sides. There are people who want to think this is really not saying what it says. It really is allowing everybody to do what really makes sense for them. If you look for that, I think it's a struggle to find that view, but you can find what you're looking for if you try hard enough in this passage. On the other hand, is the strictest, most traditional, strictest view, explanation of this passage accurate? If you want to believe that, if you just look just far enough till you think you found it, you can quit. You'll find that too. So that's the challenge here. Now, the other challenge for us is we need about 4 or 5 weeks to cover this chapter. And we have today and maybe part of next week to do it. We're not going to finish it today, but so let's begin with the beginning of this chapter. I introduced last week that Paul begins by saying, concerning the things about which you wrote. So this chapter largely is a response to questions they have. Think about the city of Corinth. The city of Corinth, if we painted a picture, just take a moment to paint a picture here, was a society where you can get a sense just looking at how much Paul talks about sexual immorality in his letter to Corinth. It was a pervasive problem. It was a city that part of the pagan worship of this city was prostitution. In Greek, Jesus dealt with the problem of pervasive divorce in Jewish society. Obviously, the 3 passages that you would look to in helping you in this, in 1 Corinthians, would be Matthew chapter 5 and the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about marriage and divorce. He again talks about it, saying virtually the same thing, but in response to a question by Jews. He talks about it in Matthew chapter 19, and then parallel passage to Matthew chapter 19 is found in Mark 10, but they're not identical. We famously are familiar with Jesus making an exception for sexual immorality in divorce. One man, one woman, it was always so from the beginning, he says. So if a man puts away his wife except for, and the word there is porneia, which is a general word for sexual immorality of many different kinds. Mark doesn't record that exception. And when Paul speaks here in 1 Corinthians 7, doesn't seem to be any mention of that exception. So there's another controversy for you to wrestle with. There are those who make the argument that Jesus did not really make that exception. That's not what his intention was. I don't agree with that. I think that he did make that exception. But I've spent a lot of time looking at both sides of that argument, and there are some good arguments on either side. So what do we do with things like this? These questions that come up. They're asking Paul questions. In a society like Corinth where divorce, it was pervasive in Jewish society, even more so in Roman Greek society, because men and women were divorcing. And you didn't really have to go get a formal written divorce. You could just leave, and that was considered you were no longer married. All right, so in a society that is pervasive, where you have all this other sexual immorality that is happening around them with the temple prostitutes and other things, it's a challenging. So they write to Paul in response to things Paul has said, as we also saw that case when we were looking at chapter 6, or we referred to beginning in verse 12 through 13. We talked about Paul was kind of echoing their slogan, what they were saying, and tending to believe. Paul echoes it and then corrects it. In chapter 5, Paul said of their desire, of his instruction to not associate with people engaged in certain such things, they took it to mean that he meant the world. He says, no, you can't not associate with anybody in the world. And so he corrects that. And I think when we come here to Matthew chapter, or 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul again is going to state what they are saying and then clarify it. And so all these questions have come up. So think about how similar that is to our day. Divorce wasn't very common in our society 75 years ago. It was rare. In fact, it was scandalous, regardless of the reason. But now, we're probably like Corinth. It's everywhere. It's constant. People take marriage very lightly. And so people are divorced at a very high rate in our culture, right? And so we end up with questions. What do we do? How do we handle this? Well, they have asked him those questions because they are writing from and living in a society like ours. And so what I don't want to leave the impression, after saying everything I've said so far, is that, well, we just don't know what Paul was saying. Paul didn't write so we would be confused. That's not his intention. He's writing to clarify. And so with that in mind, I think we have to, on some level, apply the most obvious answer. What is the most obvious answer here? And then beyond that, if we find conflict with the most obvious answer, to then look beyond, pull the curtain back and try to understand this passage in light of others and understand this passage in light of the original languages, which I think is very important in this passage. So Paul begins, chapter 7 begins with Paul saying, concerning the things about which you wrote, and then he says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Similar to what I said in chapter 6, where Paul echoes them, I think this is a conclusion that they have come to based on Paul's teaching, based on Paul's previous letter. We've discussed it. There was clearly a letter written to them prior to the one we're studying. And they have come to this conclusion, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. And that's understandable in light of everything Paul is saying about, sexual immorality. And it kind of reminds me of when Jesus, if you think back when Jesus is speaking with the rich young ruler. And, the rich young ruler was a good man, lived a good life. In fact, we're told Jesus loved him, right? But Jesus says, if you really want to be everything you're trying to be, go and sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me. And the man went away sorrowful, it says, because he had much property. And he walked away. And Jesus turns to his disciples and said, it is harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. You remember the response of the apostles? Well, then who can be saved? And you have to understand, why are they saying that? Because in their perception, the most devout people in their society, devoutly religious, in their society, were the Pharisees. We beat the Pharisees up pretty good, don't we? But they were the most devout, outwardly, visibly devout people. And you know what they also were? Most of them? Wealthy. So what they're perceiving this is, if the wealthy, aka the really devout people, can't get to heaven, then who can be saved? Well, obviously they misunderstood Jesus. They didn't understand the point. Jesus ends up having to clarify many things for the apostles. Their first reaction, their first hearing of Jesus was often an incorrect one, a mistaken one, a misunderstanding of some kind. And Jesus clarifies. That's why we have the parables. Jesus is constantly trying to explain to them. And so that has been happening as Paul is speaking to the Corinthians. They're misunderstanding some things. They're coming to the wrong conclusions. And one of the conclusions they've come to related to all this talk of sexual immorality is you just shouldn't engage. And they had even applied that within marriage. So you have two contrasting views here. In chapter 6, the problem is they think they are so elevated spiritually that they're unaffected by what they do in their body. And so they're going to temple prostitutes. And Paul says no. The other side of that coin is they're so afraid of the sexual immorality that Paul has spoken so much about that they say, I'm just not going to do anything with a woman. And the flip coin of a woman with a man. And so Paul first addresses that. He says, I agree with you that you're saying it's good for a man not to touch a woman in a certain context, but he's going to clarify and say, but because of immoralities, so because of these temptations, because of these things that you now think you're completely separating yourself, because of them, each man is to have his own wife and each woman is to have her own husband. So he says, no, that wasn't what I was saying. He says, the husband must fulfill his duty to the wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And now here's what I was saying earlier about this mutuality, this even playing field. He goes on and saying, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, which is what they were doing. So he's saying, don't do that anymore. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. He says, but this I say by way of concession, not command. So Paul here says, you're misunderstanding me. If within your marriage, the place where sexual relationships are approved, you make a mistake to think that somehow you're being superior, you're doing a good thing to withhold yourselves from each other. That's not a good thing. You're subjecting yourself to the temptation. In fact, you might wonder if you go back to chapter 6, that's part of the problem, that people who are now abstaining in their marriage are somehow justifying instead going to a prostitute. The temple prostitutes that were available in Corinth. So Paul is saying, you misunderstood me. I'm not telling you that sex is immoral. I'm telling you that sex is immoral outside of marriage. But within marriage, it's acceptable. And the other thing is that I want to point out before we leave this little section here, because I think this is probably the most easily understood part of this chapter, so we won't spend most of our time on it. But it's interesting here, in our culture, let's just put it plainly, we tend to think that sex for a husband is a privilege, for a wife it's an obligation. Is that not true? I think that's a cliche that is largely kind of how society talks about it, society works about it, works through that. Paul's not saying that here, is he? Paul isn't saying that. He's saying that the husband doesn't own his own body, but the wife. There's a mutuality that exists here. So he says, stop depriving, and he makes an exception. In this passage, this is the first of these exceptions. In this passage, Paul will introduce an ideal. This is what should happen. And then he'll introduce an exception to it. And he does that over and over in this chapter. Here's what should be. But if that isn't the case, here's your exception. All right? And he makes that exception. And here he says, but I say this by way of concession, not a command. I think he's referring to this period. That if by mutual agreement, there is a period in time when you are going to abstain and you're going to pray and focus on other things and then come back together in your sexual union, he says, I've made that concession. But otherwise, don't deprive. Stop doing that. It leads to bad things. Then he says in verse 7, yet I wish all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. So when Paul says, I wish that all men were like myself, what is he saying? What is he saying? Well, what we do know, at this point in Paul's life, he's not married. You know, he says elsewhere, can I not lead about a wife? Couldn't I be married if I wanted to be married? And so we know he wasn't married. It also seems very likely that Paul was once married. That's not a certainty by any means. There are some people who feel certain. There are people who feel certain that Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin. And they base that upon Paul saying in Acts, when he's telling his story, he says, I persecuted the church and I cast my vote against them. And they say, well, that casting of his vote is a reference to him being a member of the Sanhedrin. That is by no means conclusive to say that. There are many other ways to understand that. The second thing is, if he was a member of the Sanhedrin, members of the Sanhedrin were required to be married. You couldn't be on the Sanhedrin if you weren't married. Right? The second possibility was Paul a rabbi? When he was a Jew, he had been educated, he was highly regarded. Was he considered a rabbi? Well, if he was a rabbi, he would have been married. Third, it seems unlikely that Paul would have reached a certain age, a Jewish man, a devout Jewish man, that he would have reached a certain age without marrying, because it was the custom that you were married. It may not be somebody you met at the coffee shop. It may have been someone your parents arranged or whatever, but you were married. It was expected. So it seems unlikely, I think, that Paul was never married. I think Paul was married and at some point in time lost his wife to death or something like that. I think that's what the case is. You say, well, why doesn't it say anything about that? Let me ask you this. What happened to Mary, the mother of Jesus? What happened to Joseph? We don't know. We're not told. Why? It wasn't important. Apparently it wasn't important that we know the answer to those questions. So if we don't know what happened to Joseph or Mary, it seems reasonable that we don't know what happened to Paul's wife. But Paul didn't remarry. Paul decided not to marry. And we, I think, get a very good understanding of why Paul didn't marry in this chapter, because Paul believed that given his responsibility as an apostle, given the things he's traveling, he's in danger, he's nearly killed several times, it made no sense to lead about a wife. Instead, he focused on his calling as an apostle. And he speaks to the Corinthians and indicates it's a pretty good idea. And he's going to talk in this chapter about a coming distress, a coming persecution that they're going to endure. And he points out, when that happens, you'll be glad you're not married. You'll be glad that you don't have that concern and burden in the sense of that concern. You'll be glad you don't have that. But here, when he says, yet I wish that all men were even as I, he's not necessarily saying, I wish none of you were married. I wish everyone was single. Well, that's not the best plan for the growth of the church, is it? I wish you were all single. No, what he's saying is, I wish you all had my ability to not be led by my sexual passions. I think that's the point that Paul is making here. Because he then goes on to say, however, each man has his own gift from God. And what is the gift here? I think the gift is to have mastery over your sexual desires. Paul clearly had accomplished that. And he refers to that as a gift. He says, each man has his own gift from God. Not everybody has that ability. Not everybody has that gift. And in his case, it is a gift that he not be constantly tempted, and that he's chosen to forego remarrying in order to focus on the work of the gospel. And so he refers to it as a gift from God, that he is able to live in the way that he is. And he says, but not everybody can. Everybody has their own gift, one in this manner and one in that. So So that's the first section, the easiest section, 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 7, where Paul addresses this misconception about whether it's good to so abstain from to avoid sexual immorality, to just avoid sex altogether. And he says, no. And in other passages you could turn and look to in this, Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, where the writer, perhaps Paul, is saying, let marriage be held in honor by all. And then he goes on and said, and let the bed be undefiled, which I think sometimes is misunderstood. People take that as, see, sex in a marriage is not sinful. I think there he's saying, be true to your vows. Don't let the bed be defiled for you people that are married. But marriage is honorable. The reason that's important is, there are those who will use Paul to elevate the idea of celibacy above being married, that it's more honorable to be celibate, to not be married. And of course, as we know, there are certain groups within the general world of Christianity which teach that celibacy. And I don't think you can look at what Paul's saying and say that Paul thinks being celibate and being single is better than being married. I think anything that he says that indicates that in this chapter is related to the distress that is coming. And that if you're widowed, for example, it's good to be unmarried and you can focus on the Lord. But in all of those cases, he makes an exception to be married. And here, I think he makes it clear that there's not anything wrong with being married, and if you are married, you shouldn't be making some excuse to avoid sexual relationships because you think it's somehow more spiritual. So then we come to verse 8, where he says, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. All right? So again, if you're demarried, if you're not married, if you recall earlier in our introduction, we said this word unmarried here could refer to widowers. So he may be addressing widowers and widows in this passage. He says, look, if you're unmarried or a widow, it is good for you to remain like me. But again, that's the ideal, but he makes an exception. He says, but if they do not have self-control, let them marry. And the word here doesn't mean if they don't think they can live unmarried. That's not what he says here. He's not saying if they cannot exercise self-control, but the language here really implies that if they are not exercising self-control. So he's addressing, it may sound like it's splitting hairs, but there's a difference there. And so he's addressing those who are not abstaining. They're not able to live as he's living. If you're not able to do that, if you're not doing that, then it is better for you to marry. I think it's great for you to be unmarried for all these reasons that he enumerates. But if you're sexually promiscuous and you're being a widow, then you should marry. He says, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. And the New American Standard tries to clarify the meaning of the original language here by saying with passion. So, the two options there is it's better to marry than to burn. Is it talking about burning in hell, or is it talking about the intensity of your desires? And Paul does use that same word, where it is obvious that he's talking about intense passion, intense feelings. So he says, it's better to marry than to be constantly wrestling with and fighting and sometimes losing to your passions. Any questions about anything so far? Because we're really out of time. Any questions about that? So we're going to pick up in verse 10. We're going to finish the chapter next week. I'm try to save 5 minutes to cover chapter 8 next week, because next week's our last class. I think Mark's planning to pick up in the beginning of chapter 9. But he and I discussed it. We're not too worried about chapter 8 because it's really been covered thoroughly with 4 sermons recently about Romans 14, and it's nearly identical. So I think it's better to focus our attention on this chapter because it's so relevant. So we'll pick up in chapter 7 and verse 10 next week.